Hi, good morning, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Dave Edwards, and I am the acting director, normally chief deputy director here at OEHA. Um, and so this webinar today is the fifth in a series of webinars the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, or OEHA, is hosting as part of our efforts to track and report on climate change and its impacts on California. At each webinar, speakers present a synthesis of the current scientific understanding on the featured topic and examples of actions underway to address the impacts. These examples are a small fraction of the work across California to develop and implement sustainable, equitable solutions to the challenges posed by climate change. As many of you know, OEA publishes the Indicators of Climate Change in California report. Both the report's contents and the process to compile it demonstrate the importance of collaboration and partnerships in understanding and tackling the climate challenges that confront us. It is in that same spirit of collaboration and partnership that OEHA is convening these webinars with our state agency partners. Each webinar is an opportunity to strengthen partnerships among OEHA, our co-conveners, and the organizations represented by the speakers. Each webinar is also a chance to learn about areas of climate science or climate action that may be new for some of you joining us today. OEHA is grateful for these opportunities and for Cali PA Secretary Yana Garcia's strong support of the partnerships and learnings resulting from this webinar series. The world's oceans play a critical role as a buffer against human-induced climate change. They absorb about 25% of carbon dioxide emissions and 90% of the excess heat from global warming. As a result, oceans have been acidifying and getting warmer. The dire ecological consequences of warming waters were evident during the prolonged period of unusually high ocean temperatures off the California coast from 2014 to 2016. During this marine heat wave, there were mass strandings of marine mammals and seabirds, toxic algal blooms that led to the closure of crab fisheries, the loss of kelp forests, and a record number of whale entanglements and fishing gear as humpback whales were forced closer to shore to feed. We would like to thank our colleagues at the California Ocean Protection Council for planning and convening this webinar with us. This morning, we have a full lineup of speakers who will talk about the changing ocean and coastal conditions influenced by climate change and their impacts on California. We look forward to hearing them present examples of tribal, federal, state, local, and community actions to address these impacts. I'll now turn it over to Carmen Milanes to continue with this morning's program. Carmen.
Thank you, Dave. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Carmen Milanes. I'm program lead for the Climate Change Indicator Program at OEHA. With me behind the scenes are members of the indicator team, Tamara Cutter, Bennett Locke, Lori Monserrat, Emma Tanner, and Annika Alexander Ozinskas. Before we begin, I just want to take a couple of minutes to go over logistics. We will hold questions until after all the presentations. We do hope we have a full lineup, but we hope to have some time after all the presentations to have a brief Q&A session to address questions. You have two options for bringing up questions. Feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A box at any time. We've asked our speakers to type in responses to those questions as they're able, or during the Q&A, please raise your hand to request to be unmuted and ask your question verbally. As Dave has mentioned, we are pleased to co-host this morning's webinar with the California Ocean Protection Council, and we are especially grateful to Ella McDougall for planning the webinar with us. Ella is the Ocean Protection Council's Climate Change Program Manager, and she will be moderating this morning's webinar. So with that, Ella, it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Carmen. This is a really wonderful event, and we're very excited to gather such a wonderful lineup of speakers today. Hi, everybody. I'm Ella McDougall. I'm the Climate Change Program Manager with the Ocean Protection Council, and I've been working with Carmen and the team at OEHA to put this webinar together. So we're going to jump into our first speaker. I'm really excited to introduce Andrew Leising. He's a research oceanographer at the NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center. And he's been there for over 20 years. He has co-led NOAA's Integrated Ecosystem Assessment Team's annual ecosystem status report. His personal research is on marine heat waves and fisheries oceanography. He received his PhD from Scripps Institution of Oceanography, where he studied the impacts of environmental variability on plankton dynamics. Andrew, please take it away.
Great, thank you. Just check, make sure you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. All right, I'm going to switch to my screen then. All right, and if somebody can just verbally confirm they're seeing that, all right, still hearing me?
Looks good.
Okay, great, then I'll jump right into it. I first just want to thank the host for having me here. It's very exciting to be part of this little symposium. But let me jump right into it because we don't have too much time. So as Ella just mentioned in my introduction, one of the things I'm part of is an annual report that a group of NOAA fisheries scientists put together every year. And we present this report to the Pacific Fisheries Management Council. And this report basically details what's been happening in the marine ecosystem over the past year. And sometimes we go back to ancient history to sort of talk about what's been going on. Just to put it in a nutshell, in case there's anybody listening who doesn't know much about the Pacific Fisheries Management Council, essentially this is the group that decides what, when, and where you can fish for basically all the fish we want to catch out in the ocean, and they're primarily responsible for the federal waters, which is everything from 3 miles kind of out to offshore. So every year we put together this report, and in this report we have a bunch of indicators that talk about what's going on in the environment. And what I've done here is just outline sort of the major ones that are very focused in some ways on giving us information about climate change. And there's a ton of things in this report, but really the one that's most, I think, important to talk about is ocean temperatures. And so I'm going to jump right into that particular indicator. And this will also be important to the talks coming after me, as you'll see. So looking at the trends in global ocean warming, this is data from NOAA that's covering all the world's oceans. And as you can see, over time, the oceans are warming. This shouldn't be news to anyone, really. But if we look at our local waters, this is data from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography PEER. It's one of the longest time series we have measured in a consistent fashion of ocean temperature. And you notice even in our, we'll saw this are sort of our local California waters. It's a good indicator of sort of California waters. As well here, we can see that there's a clear trend of increasing temperatures over time. Okay, so moving on, just a little bit of science background as to what really controls our temperatures off of California. It's really concerned with this process called upwelling. So we've got the long-term trends, but sitting on top of the long-term trend in just general ocean warming, our day-to-day coastal temperatures are really controlled by this process called upwelling. And upwelling, simply put, is when the wind blows across the top of the ocean. Because of Coriolis and a bunch of other physical factors, basically that water gets moved offshore at the surface and it brings up really cold water to the coastline. So this is a really critical physical process of what's controlling our sort of day-to-day temperatures in a big way along the whole coast of the US, west coast of the US, and particularly in California. So this is a map made from a satellite. And basically what this map is showing is where it's red, it's saying the water temperature is warmer than it normally would be. And where it's blue, the water is colder than it normally would be. So you can, and then overlaid on top of it, all the little arrows are the wind. And if you can see them, there's very thin lines that are pressure. And those are very similar to the pressure lines you'll see on your evening news for weather maps, okay? So that's atmospheric pressure. And what you can see here clearly is that there's this big mass of really warm water way off the coastline, but right up near the shore, we have wind that's blowing towards the south. And as I was just saying, this causes upwelling. It leads to our really nice, cool coastal conditions. And so that is really a sort of natural feature of the environment that buffers our coastal temperatures, particularly in California, where we tend to have these strong southerly winds. Now, of course, I'm sure everybody's looking at this going, oh boy, but there's this huge warm mass of water. And as I think it was Dave was saying in the introduction, he mentioned this big heat waves, these marine heat waves we've been having. And so Yet again, here we have another one. We've been having marine heat waves almost every year since that big feature in 2014, 2016. If you want to learn more about the past details, here's a little link to that. So I'm just going to now talk a little bit about these marine heat waves because they're really important, what's been happening more recently in the California current. So you might ask, what is a marine heat wave? This is kind of overly detailed graph of that, but basically a marine heat wave is defined as any time basically the temperature measurements are greater than 90% of the measures we've ever had at a particular spot on a particular day. So this means you can have actually a heat wave in the middle of the winter, but the water itself won't be super hot. But if it's much hotter than we would normally expect for that date and time of year, then that counts as a heat wave. Okay, so that's what a heat wave is. So these things really got on our sort of collective consciousness back in 2014 to 2016. And this is, again, this map showing you where the temperatures are warmer than normal. And you'll notice this big, huge area of really warm temperatures off the West Coast. And this one we kind of call, this particular event, we refer to it as the blob. As you can see, it's sort of blob-like. And this giant warm water pool lasted for nearly 3 years, from 2014 all the way through 2016. So looking at the trends in these marine heat waves, this is a figure showing how many marine heat waves have been in this sort of what we call the exclusive economic zone. That's a area about 200 nautical miles off the coastline. And you'll notice there's been a big switch. Since about 2013, we've been having these near shore marine heat waves year after year after year. Okay, so there's been a trend, a big uptick in these. Now, you might say, well, is this just because there's more heat waves, or is it because of the background warming that I talked about at the beginning? So this bottom plot is showing you what happens when you take out the background climate change and just look for the marine heat waves themselves. And you notice, yes, were a lot of heat waves in the past, but you'll still see that there's clearly an increase in these marine heat waves since about 2013. So looking in general, what are some of the impacts of these heat waves and other just general warming on the animals in the environment? Well, one of the things that we clearly see is a shift in the distribution. So this graph basically shows how climate warming over time has shifted the range of species. So basically things move northwards to maintain a system where they have the same temperatures that they're most happy. Okay. Similarly, what else can animals do? A lot of times they'll change depth. And so over time, you see here, a lot of species just going deeper and deeper in the ocean to avoid those warm surface temperatures. And this can have impacts on how people can access these fish for fishing for them. Another important thing is just we can look back at these heat waves. And in some sense, these heat waves are a natural experiment of what we might expect just the general warming trend to cause. And I say, everyone, this is a fantastic paper that was written back in 2016 by Koval et al. That talks about who the losers and the winners are under just generally sort of warming oceans and these marine heat waves in specific. So there's a detailed list here. I'm not going to go through it too much. I think it was Dave's name that said at the beginning that there's actually some impacts on Dungeness crab. That's a big one for California. Usually those are negative impacts because the fishery will be closed due to toxic algal blooms. Also, whales tend to be impacted because they end up getting closer to shore and have more impacts. They get hit by boats, and they also tend to then get tangled in nets more often. There are, however, a few winners as we have these warmer conditions near the coast. Tuna and some of the large sport fish tend to come in earlier and closer to the coast. So that's good for the folks that fish for them. So another thing we've been trying to put together in our report is how also these climate impacts may impact just the general fisheries that are up and down the West Coast. And something we just started this last year is make these maps showing social vulnerability. So this is how much a coastal community can survive changes in their sort of sources of economics. And you'll notice there's this region of Northern California up through Oregon that's red. So these are the districts where we feel that these communities are most vulnerable to change in their economics. And what's interesting is we can overlay the regions of where the ocean conditions were most favorable. So in the ocean part, you'll see that it's blue along the coast there. So fortunately, these regions that are socially vulnerable also overlap with the region that is oceanographically most favorable for production of fisheries and things like that. But as I was saying earlier, with climate change, there's the risk that all of these ranges may decrease or shift northward, which would change the relative coincidence between the socially vulnerable areas and where it's best for fishing and overall productivity. So this is something we're tracking carefully over time. Just some more specifics on these marine heat waves in general over this last, say, almost, 10 years now, is that these marine heat waves typically come in and hit the coast in the fall. They often reach the coastal California region, sometimes a little bit in summer, but then more again followed in the fall. They're often followed by harmful algal bloom events, that's HAB there. Those harmful algal bloom events in turn often lead to shellfish closures like they did last year. There was quite a few closures of Dungeness and other shellfish. Again, these things can cause changes in the species ranges and also the timing of when different species are available to be fished upon. Warmer temperatures in general lead to smaller organisms, so that has a lot of impacts too on how much energy you get per fish you catch. The warmer temperatures tend to have lower productivity of the overall system. And again, a big one in terms of whale interactions is this east-west habitat compression. So as those heat waves move in off the coast, they tend to narrow down a sort of corridor where the whales like to be and bringing the whales closer to shore, and they have more interactions with fisheries. So just to summarize all of this, ocean warming is really an ongoing process, and it has many, many consequences beyond even the few things I had time to say here. But it's important to note that besides that long-term trend, we seem to have this, over the last 10 years, increased variability, primarily due to the presence of these marine heat waves. And on top of that, I didn't have time for it, but California, as everyone's probably aware, also gets El Niños like we just did this last year. And it's a different type of heat wave that has its own set of consequences. Most of them are typically negative on fisheries, but that's yet another source of variability that's very important. And all of these things are critical because these dynamics, as the ocean warms, either from the long-term change or from marine heat waves or El Niños, these effects are all additive. And all of these things affect sea level, which I think you're going to now hear a lot from the other speakers at this seminar. And this plot on the right is the computer model projections of just how much ocean level will be likely rising under different climate scenarios. And this is the sea level rise due just to thermal expansion. So this isn't including melting of glaciers or things like that. So it's actually quite a bit that's responsible just from the warming of the ocean itself is affecting sea level rise. And that is it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was really fascinating. Love really important information to give us kind of the foundation of what we're going to talk about next. And we're cruising on time. So thanks so much. We're going to next introduce Adam Canter. Adam is the Natural Resources Director for the Wiyot tribe, located on the far north coast of California in what is now part of Humboldt County. Adam has been with the Wiyot since 2014 and has been working as a biologist and botanist on the North Coast for 20 years, focusing on ecological restoration, rare species and habitat conservation, sensitive natural communities, geographic information systems, and ethnobotany. So interesting. In his current position, Adam drafts and manages grant programs in support of protecting tribal resources and fosters collaboration and partnerships with tribal citizens and environmental groups to tackle complex natural resource issues like climate change adaptation and sea level rise. So Adam, the floor is all yours. Thanks so much.
Well, hello everyone. Good morning. Thanks, Ella, and thanks, Andrew, for that great presentation about the blob and our marine heat waves. Today, I'm just going to be showing a bunch of pretty pictures, or maybe not all pretty pictures, but to kind of talk about, how climate change is impacting both, tribal cultural resources and subsistence gathering, and the community up here on the North Coast. Right now, we're looking at a picture of Wigi, or Humboldt Bay, and Shawar, the Wiyot word for ocean, and animals, plants, parts of nature are all seen, through the tribal lens as relatives that we live in relationship with, and reciprocity. And so that's going to be a common theme. Humboldt Bay, due to our location on the triple junction, is actually experiencing the highest rate of sea level rise on the West Coast, both due to subsidence and sea level rise. There we go. And I threw this up here. It's a little rough poster I found, but kind of just showing some of the connections that the Wiyot have with the marine and estuarine environment. The Wiyot are really an estuarine culture, living around the estuaries of Wiggy, Humboldt Bay, the Wiyot, which is the Eel, the Vodawat, the Mad River estuaries. And the tribe takes their name from Wiyot, which is the word for Eel River. And we're looking at the estuary here, which is an area that has changed a lot in recent time. And early settlers to the area mistakenly called Pacific lamprey eels when they first saw them, but really the river is named after Pacific lamprey, which are a parasitic fish that are an anadromous species as well, who spawn up in cool tributaries and then make their way out into the ocean and latch on to humpback whales and salmon and other creatures. And I threw this on here, thinking about marine upwelling and our cool coastal climate that we all love on the coast of California and the West Coast as it's triple digits inland. Also make kind of the redwood belt and the fog belt possible. And so those upwellings that happen and bringing that cool ocean water up to the surface kind of help to generate our fog bank, making the redwoods possible. And of course, we've seen decreases in fog over the last few years. And looking at the watersheds of Wiyot ancestral territory and sea level rise, the NOAA projection is 1 to 2 meters. We see this is really going to impact a lot of salt marsh habitat, areas that are currently ecotone, kind of between uplands and estuarine habitats. And right now the tribe is working on its climate adaptation plan to assess those areas. I show this picture to just kind of show, this is Mad River Annie, one of the earlier photos of the Wiyot matriarch out at the mouth of the Vodawat or the Mad River in Humboldt County. Just looking at all the kind of items that just show generations of traditional ecological knowledge that's kind of represented in this photograph. If you look in the back, you can see a bunch of surf fish drying on some big redwood borers and of course basketry materials. And this is an area that's been impacted by invasive species like European beach grass, which has caused the estuary and the mouth to migrate many miles north of where it was historically. And yes, sea level rise. This is looking at the Wiyot site of Tuluwat in the middle of Humboldt Bay at a king tide in 2010, and a site that was a shell midden or is a shell midden, and over time harvesting shellfish, which are super important to Wiyot subsistence practices and life ways, continued to raise the elevations of these sites. And when the tribes were pulled off these sites, of course, shells were no longer able to be added, and we've seen them become less resilient to sea level rise. We've been out documenting king tides around the bay and are starting to see more and more coastal flooding during these events. This is out at the Hickshari estuary mouth near the entrance of Humboldt Bay, where there was this really unique freshwater wetland on kind of the middle of the spit, where we've seen one of kind of our first real noticeable impacts of climate change, as this area has been inundated the last couple winter storms and king tides. And so we've seen the death of all these wax myrtles and this kind of change of this really unique ecosystem. And of course, many cultural sites are threatened to be lost during sea level rise or storm surge events. This is just a little table kind of showing different watersheds and their impacts during tsunamis and different inundation levels. But one of the big areas that the tribe has shown leadership in the North Coast is stewarding legacy contaminated sites from the industrial legacy of Humboldt Bay in the lumber boom. And so we've got a lot of areas that are contaminated with dioxins, PCBs, and other chemicals like that were used as wood preservatives, but also shipping industry kind of impacts. This is Tulwat Island. This site I was showing earlier is the Wiyot center of the universe, and for about a century it was used as a dry dock and heavily contaminated with lead paints, PCBs, and over many years, the tribe led a cleanup effort and got one of the first EPA awards for site cleanup, remediating this site so it can still be used for ceremony today, really benefiting the environment, for everyone that lives in and around the bay and depends on it. Of course, sea level rise is not just, inundation, but groundwater impacts. This is something that the tribe is monitoring and that we want to continue to be a bellwether for as we start to see impacts to groundwater from sea level rise. We talked about algae. One thing in our droughts, with increased water temperatures, we see the proliferation of invasive species like Sacramento pike minnow, which thrive in warmer waters and feed on juvenile salmonids and lamprey. The tribe is working to research removal methods as that's going to be a large part of restoring the salmon stocks on the Eel River, which as a super huge blow to both the blue economy and the fishing community up here in tribal communities. We saw the second year of full salmon closure up here, really impacting culture and the economy. And of course, shellfish, our mudflats are pretty historic up here. And with, eelgrass beds, Humboldt Bay contains the largest proportion of eelgrass in the state of California, despite being one of the smaller estuaries in the state that serve as nursery sites. And the tribe continues to do water quality monitoring around the bay to track things like temperature, pH, salinity. And we've seen recent closures in shellfishing, of course, from domoic acid, which occurs when this naturally occurring marine algae, Pseudonychia, experiences warmer conditions and produces this potent neurotoxin, really impacting subsistence gathering. And Humboldt Bay is also the largest oyster producing bay in the state, partly because of our eelgrass beds, which help to mitigate ocean acidification and impacts to shellfish shells and oyster shells, but also store massive amounts of carbon and are really important for the whole ecosystem. And the tribe is also help to inventory for ichthyoplankton, species like longfin smelts, rare species in the bay. And the marine heat wave, the really big one that happened in the drought year of 2021 that's impacting salmon stocks today, I threw this picture on because this is when the Van Dusen River, a lower tributary to the Eel, completely dried up. And so, still seeing the impacts of that 2021 drought on our ocean anadromous species. Green sturgeon, another really important cultural species of the tribe, impacted by drought. The tribe helps to identify the eel as an important area for green sturgeon. But also impacts to the dunes. The Wiyot or bulb farmers and moved bulbs, Indian potatoes, around to their village sites, many of which are threatened by sea level rise and erosion. Here we see scarping, where we have beach loss during storm surge. And our salt marshes help to attenuate a lot of that wave energy. Right now, the tribe is working to remove Spartina densiflora, an invasive Chilean cordgrass that has taken over our marshes and impacted sediment dynamics and carbon sequestration. But when asking the tribe, what do we do about climate change? Really, habitat conservation and restoring habitats so that they're fully functioning ecosystems is one of the largest things we can do to build climate resilience, including protecting important habitat areas like Marashawak, which the tribe was able to use Ocean Protection Council funds to acquire this really unique coastal habitat that has both lowland areas that are projected to be inundated by sea level rise, but also upland areas and wetlands to be able to allow salt marsh ecosystems and ecotones to migrate inland and upland with sea level rise. And of course, restoring our dunes, removing European beach grass and plants like ice plant and pampas grass has been shown by the Humboldt Coastal Resilience Project to allow dunes to migrate inland with sea level rise and storm surge, making them more resilient and increasing the resilience of Humboldt Bay in general. But I think this is my last slide, looking out at the South Wiggy and some of our massive eelgrass beds, which are going to continue to be important to the ecosystem of the bay, and we're continuing to watch for signs of impacts from increased ocean temperatures and other impacts from future potential increased dredging from proposed development projects on Humboldt Bay. But yeah, I'll just say, when you're thinking about climate change, the tribes have been acclimating to climate change since time immemorial, and they really should be, at the front seat of the table when we're trying to tackle large issues like this for humans and all other relatives. So thank you all.
Great, thanks so much, Adam. That was a really fascinating presentation spanning so much history of the Wiyot tribe to risks of climate change and current efforts going forward. So thank you for that interesting and diverse presentation. I loved the photo of the matriarch. That was probably my favorite part. So thanks. We're going to move on to our next presentation, which is with OPC's very own Kaitlyn Kalua. So Kaitlyn Kalua is the Deputy Director for the Ocean Protection Council. As Deputy Director, Kaitlyn provides executive level leadership and is responsible for the development and implementation of policies, programs, and procedures to advance OPC's strategic priorities. Kaitlyn served as OPC's Water Quality Program Manager from November 2021 to July 2023, where she led policy initiatives and programs to protect and improve coastal and marine water quality and served as staff lead on legislation. Kaitlyn came to OPC with experience in water quality regulation and policy, equitable water access, coastal adaptation planning, and federal ocean policy. Prior to joining OPC, Kaitlyn served as policy manager for the California Coastkeeper Alliance and served as a Sea Grant Fellow, a Canal Sea Grant Fellow in 2017 with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Kaitlyn received her JD and Environmental Law Certificate from the University of California, Davis School of Law. Thanks, Kaitlyn. So all yours.
Thank you. I'm going to try and get this presentation mode going. Thank you for your patience. Hopefully this is going. All right, Ella, is that in presentation mode?
Yes, it looks great.
Fantastic. I'm going to move this. Great. Well, good morning, all. Just so grateful to be here with the full panel. Thank you to Dr. Leising and for Adam Canter. My name is Kaitlyn Kalua. Again, thank you, Ella, for the introduction. I'm Deputy Director for the California Ocean Protection Council, which is a cabinet-level state policy body within the California Natural Resources Agency, whose mission is to ensure healthy coastal and ocean ecosystems, and a key role of OPC is to fund innovative research and to help fill information needs across California's agencies to inform our decisions impacting the coast and ocean. This includes tracking climate change impacts to inform our actions and decisions both on the local and state level. And today, this presentation will focus on a relatively small suite of ocean and coastal indicators, building from the previous presentations. And of course, we'll go into further detail with the next set of presentations, which these really only scratch the surface, but also provide important insight into the way that climate change and these related stressors are connected and kind of compound the challenges facing our coast and ocean. So beginning with sea level rise, just a brief overview of what do we know? We know that sea level rise has significant impacts on our coastal communities, ecosystems through increased coastal erosion, increased flooding, impacts an intrusion of saltwater into freshwater aquifers, as well as a loss of habitat for plants, animals, and loss of beaches and recreational spaces. In analyzing tide gauge data over the past century, sea levels along the California coast have risen approximately 6 inches, with an average statewide increase of just under an inch per decade, which is consistent with global patterns of sea level rise. However, these rates are projected to significantly accelerate. OPC recently adopted the 2024 update to the State of California Sea Level Rise Guidance. This is a guidance that was previously published in 2018 and is updated approximately every 5 years to incorporate the latest science and updated projections for sea level rise through the year 2150. These latest projections provide, on average, that base sea levels are anticipated to increase by just under a foot to 1.2 feet statewide over the next 30 years, that is through 2050, and up to 3.1 to 6.6 feet through 2100 under 5 different scenarios based on various greenhouse gas emissions and rate of sea ice melt, among other factors that impact sea level rise. Overall, throughout the state of California, as we can see on this slide here, is that there is a wide range of local variation statewide related to sea level rise that is driven primarily through vertical land motion. For example, in Humboldt Bay, you'll see here, the land is sinking, it's subsiding at among the most, the highest rates among the state. And as a consequence, sea level rise is projected up to 1.6 feet in the next 30 years, as opposed to a high scenario projection of 1.2 feet by 2050. Meanwhile, just north of Humboldt Bay in Crescent City, the relative sea level rise is actually there's a land uplift that, due to vertical land motion, that is surpassing the current observed rate of sea level rise, and therefore is not actually seeing that increase of sea level at the same rates you see statewide, as shown in this figure. Thank you. This 2024 Science and Policy Update to the State of California guidance provides, again, these 5 different scenarios that reflect the plausible range of future sea level rise under all greenhouse gas emission estimates. It specifically applies the latest international and federal projections to the state of California, and overall reflects a greater level of certainty in the range of sea level rise in the next 30 years, that is by 2050, with a wider range of potential sea level rise rates after the year 2100. It's important to note that sea level rise, when it's combined with the extreme storms, as was previously described in the last presentation, as well as with higher tides, can result in accelerated cliff and bluff erosion, increased coastal flooding, and flooding from groundwater intrusion, which poses a significant threat to water supplies and adjacent infrastructure. Recent king tide events, that is, these extreme high tides, occur several times per year and have recently co-occurred with winter storms, which has caused significant damage as well as cost across the state. As one example, the financial cost of last year's storms exceeded over $34 billion in coastal storm damages. And importantly, this catastrophic flooding we saw in 2022, 2023 does provide an indicator of what what the future may hold for sea level rise and the impacts we can expect to see. These adverse impacts are also not seen equitably statewide. Sea level rise hazards are anticipated to have disproportionate impacts on communities that have the least capacity to adapt and could exacerbate many existing environmental injustices, particularly those that are in low-lying areas or located near contaminated sites or near areas with contaminants that can mobilize from our soils, during these coastal flooding events. The 2024 guidance, therefore, provides a recommendation for a precautionary stepwise approach for incorporating sea level rise scenarios, that is, those 5 different scenarios, into our planning and adaptation projects statewide, with the most precautionary approach when feasible, to be applied to evaluate both that intermediate, high, and high range scenarios, again, across those 5 scenarios that's provided in the guidance update, to assess the full range of potential impacts, the consequences of our planning decisions, as well as to inform the full range of adaptation strategies. Keeping an eye on time, I'm switching gears from sea level rise or coastal hazards to then the climate stressors in the marine environment. We had previously heard impacts of harmful algal blooms, and that harmful algal blooms specifically pose a threat to California's aquatic ecosystems, our fisheries, our marine life. HABs are short term for HABs, can be formed by numerous different species of phytoplankton and cyanobacteria that can produce toxins and are often associated with the warmer waters described by Dr. Leising, changes in wind patterns or water stagnation of waters, particularly more inland and bays, as well as nutrient inputs that can fuel the HAB, phytoplankton and cyanobacteria. In California, blooms of Pseudonychia have exhibited a pretty strong seasonality, with this toxin appearing predominantly in spring. What is shown here in these 2 graphs is that this HAB will produce this toxin and will produce the toxin of domoic acid that can contaminate shellfish, that is, harmful for human consumption as well as harmful to marine life. The figure shown here shows the relative abundance of Pseudonychia, and that is in blue, and domoic acid, that's those orange bars here, at 2 Central Coast locations, which shows both the strong seasonality but also the sub-regional variability between these 2 sites. Pseudonychia, over this course of about a 20-year timescale, is showing it's migrating northward, as well as there's a new sustained domoic acid hotspot that has emerged off the coast of California following the 2014-2016 marine heat wave event. Domoic acid, which is produced by Pseudonychia, does have serious effects on marine life. It can bioaccumulate as well as have impacts to the full food web. It also has the ability to cause pretty significant marine mammal stranding events as well as mortality. In this past year alone, domoic acid caused 2 significant marine mammal stranding events in California of various sea lions, dolphins, with the first event occurring from August to October of 2022, which was centered in the Santa Barbara Channel and was linked to over 300 known or identified marine mammal strandings that occurred between Los Angeles to San Mateo County, so a pretty large swath of the coast, as well as in a following summer from last summer of May to July of 2023 was an even larger mass stranding event with approximately 1,000 marine mammals stranded throughout Southern California. Impacts of HABs also include lower dissolved oxygen, that is hypoxia from the actual decay of the algae that can cause significant fish kills. That was seen in the summer of 2022 as a red tide event in San Francisco Bay that resulted in the death of tens of thousands of fish due to lower dissolved oxygen, as well as economic impacts that are caused by fisheries delays or closures associated to HAB events. And just a brief note, another ocean climate indicator or stressor is then ocean acidification. As greenhouse gas emissions increase, we also see then an increase in carbon dioxide that is absorbed within the ocean, which in turn lowers pH and causes ocean acidification. Long-term data is relatively limited in California, although there are a number of both state and federal efforts and a number of partners increasing cruises and data off the coast of California. With the best and longest data set currently in Southern California, which is demonstrated or shown here, which has indicated that coastal waters in Southern California are acidifying, with subsurface waters at approximately 100 meters in depth trending and already often below critical thresholds where shells of small marine organisms, pteropods, would be expected to have about moderate to severe shell dissolution, which is this red corrosive line that you see in this graph. And to describe this in a little more detail, we're evaluating the impacts of ocean acidification based on a threshold of aragonite saturation state of 1.4. That is a potential threshold for essentially where you begin to see impacts of shell dissolution when organisms can display this moderate shell dissolution. That's this graph in the middle, whereas a lower state of aragonite saturation of 1 is when you begin to see more severe shell dissolution on the far right-hand side of the slide. OPC is currently investing in expanding our ocean acidification monitoring programs, primarily in two ways. That is, first, to increase the geographic scope, to increase data in Central and Northern California, as well as adding a biological component to monitoring to examine the extent to which crabs and other small organisms, pteropods that form the base of the food chain are being impacted by ocean acidification. And finally,
Kaitlyn, I'm so sorry, so sorry. I gotta jump in. We're just time is running a little tight, just to let you know.
Perfect. I will wrap up on our last indicator here with dissolved oxygen, which will often co-occur with ocean acidification. In that, again, sorry, bear with me as I take a step back. In that OA and ocean acidification and hypoxia, again, can co-occur and affect organism survival, growth, as well as have numerous different effects at different life stages for organisms. And the severity can depend on whether this hypoxia or low pH occur in tandem or alone. And so we have seen since the mid-1990s, significant low oxygen events have been observed in Southern California Bight, that is south of the Santa Barbara Channel, as well as changes in ocean chemistry. Excuse me, I'm trying to keep an eye on time. Changes in ocean chemistry in concert with changes in the warming ocean temperatures that was described in the first presentation can lead to greater and more diverse impacts on our coastal marine ecosystems. And this is something that OPC is currently investing in investigating the connection between ocean acidification, hypoxia, as well as potential habitat compression, that is the vertical viable habitat for calcifiers and marine species in the water column. Final note, what I shared today, again, it was only a small snapshot of ocean health in California. I know NOAA, Dr. Leising, has also provided a number of resources related to ocean ecosystem health along the California current. And that this is part of a larger effort by OPC in partnership with the West Coast Ocean Alliance and Ocean Science Trust to develop an interactive public-facing data portal and 2025 Ocean and Coast Health Report Card, essentially to evaluate, assess, and publicly communicate the status and trends of our coast and ocean. And with this effort to be completed by the end of next year. And with that, thank you, and thank you, Ella, for the time check.
Thank you so much, Kaitlyn. That was wonderful. And of course, very near and dear to my heart because it's a lot of the work that I get to work on. So thank you. We are gonna move along to our next presentation, which is three presentations or three presenters together. And I'm gonna introduce each of them now, and then I will turn it over to these three. So first, we're gonna start with Kate Hagemann, who recently joined the City of Rafael as the Climate Adaptation and Resilience Planner. She was previously the Resilience Program Manager for Adaptation within Miami-Dade County's Office of Resilience, where she led the implementation of the county's sea level rise strategy. She also led the vulnerability assessment of the county's critical infrastructure to future flood risks, and integrated resilience into county policies and programs, and helped create the Adaptation Action Area program focused on addressing the areas most vulnerable to sea level rise. She earned her Master of Environmental Science from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Science, where she studied how cities can use a hybrid of gray and green infrastructure to adapt to rising sea levels. Our second speaker will be Carly Finkle, Senior Policy Manager with the Canal Alliance, a community-based organization located in the Canal neighborhood, which is one of the most vulnerable communities to sea level rise in the Bay Area. Canal Alliance provides direct services to the primarily Spanish-speaking immigrant community, and it advocates to remove barriers to their success. Carly's work has focused on educating and engaging community residents in sea level rise planning, with a particular focus on how climate change will affect and exacerbate the existing housing crisis. And finally, we will have Rita Mazariegos, a member of the San Rafael Sea Level Rise Steering Committee, and she has lived in the Canal neighborhood for 18 years. So I will turn it over to you folks. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ella. Well, thank you everyone for having us. My colleague Carly and I are going to talk about the impacts of sea level rise here in San Rafael. We'll talk first. I'm going to speak first about the climate risks, some of the physical risks facing the community, and then Carly will talk about the environmental justice components and the planning work that they're leading here in San Rafael. So just so I know we have a lot of information that's been coming, and I'll try and go through a lot of this relatively quickly. But for those who aren't familiar, I just thought that I would provide a little bit of a picture of why. So the city of San Rafael is the most vulnerable community in the Bay Area to sea level rise. We often think about climate change as a future issue, as something that will, 6 feet or 3 feet by 2100. But because of the ocean warming and other changes that have already caused sea levels to rise about 8 inches in the Bay Area, we already see the impacts here during high tides, and the impacts that will be felt in the coming decades are even more acute. So why it's the most vulnerable area really breaks down into a few simple factors. Basically, originally the land was very low. Unfortunately, the land continues to subside or to sink, and it's currently buffered from some flooding due to a very informal shoreline. So I'll step through each one of those one at a time. But for those who aren't familiar, the landscape here has a pattern of high ground or these ridges alternating with areas of low ground in between. So this is an adjacent area here where you can see in between these ridges of higher ground, we have the marshes and that had tidal channels, still do, where it's undeveloped, tidal channels that meander back up to the toe of those ridges. And the city of San Rafael before development had a similar pattern. If we look at old historic photos, we can see the same high ground and then low ground. And I know this is a very old and grainy photo, but you might be able to make out that there are these tidal channels that meander back right to the toe of the downtown. But over time, like many coastal communities, there's been a lot of development on those low-lying areas, those formerly wetland areas. And in some cases, in addition to building on the existing wetlands, the bay was filled in this case, in one area with construction debris in order to build land to facilitate development. But the area that we're focused on here is called the Canal, and it's adjacent to this canal here. And a lot of the apartments were built right on top of these wetlands, using fill, sand, and other materials to create the foundation. So this is a picture from the 60s, looking back into the downtown. And this little area that we see here, this triangle here, we have more than 10,000 residents that live on top of that area now. So because of that history of development and the sort of foundation of the city, it continues to subside rather quickly today. So this is one area where we have reports for geotechnical reports, and in this spot, the ground has subsided around 2 feet since the 1970s, and we expect it to subside another 2 to 4 feet. Because it's a coastal environment, obviously without any sea level rise, that in of itself would be a problem and be increasing the flooding risk. But of course, it's the combination of those two factors. So as the land is going down, of course, at the same time, the sea level is going up. And so here we have those two added together, making the change feel a little more acute. So we also can use remote sensing data to see the areas of subsidence. Here, the green are areas that are stable on more stable bedrock, and the areas that on this color gradient trend towards the deep red are subsiding more quickly. So for those that work in millimeters, sea level rising around 3 millimeters. And in some cases, we have subsidence rates that are in excess of 20 millimeters a year. For most areas, it's around, it's less than that. But in a place where we do have this quick subsidence, what it means is that in a place like this picture, we have the bay obviously rising, but the water right now, the salt water can't flood the community because the shoreline in this picture is just a little bit higher than our highest tides. So the highest tides we've had recently are around 8.1. The ground here is 0.3 of a foot higher than that. But this spot is subsiding at around a foot every 20 years. So it doesn't take very long before we see that the ground, maybe before the end of this decade, is no longer higher than the highest tide. And of course, as we go into the future and we add more subsidence and more sea level rise, that difference becomes even more greater. And so we have these other pathways where salt water can now get in and flood this area. But stepping back, the other main factor here that we have that's perhaps a little bit unique to this community is that the land is already lower than the bay during high tides because of that subsidence. So in this picture, you might be able to see that the car here is actually lower than this dock. So the bay is already higher than the ground in most places, but it's protected by a very informal shoreline. So in this map, you can see these areas that are in light blue here. Everything that's in light blue is on land that's already lower than our highest tides. So basically the land is already in some cases 2 to 4 feet lower, maybe 2 to 5 feet lower than the highest tides. So if you try and picture what does that look like, you know, if we have one person who's out paddleboarding and another person who's walking through the neighborhood at the highest tides, that person walking through the neighborhood is 4 feet lower than the person out paddleboarding. So there's a potential for flooding just from high tides alone, no storms, that's already very significant. But we don't see that every tide because we have this network of very informal barriers. So these are privately owned. They were just constructed by the individual property owners, like the owner of this strip mall, over time. They're not designed by an engineer. They weren't designed with a certain level of protection. They're not connected. They're not maintained or inspected, but they're working as a dam of sorts. So you might be able to see these boats in the back, the water line here for the boat being higher than this minivan in part. And we have all along the canal different types of barriers that have been erected at different times, sometimes made of wood, sometimes in different states of repair. And in this picture, you can see they've added on over time, adding a little curb, adding an additional speed bump to try and stay above the tides as they increase. But for those of you that work in flood risk, you can probably see there's not very much freeboard here. There isn't very much left before the water levels will be higher than these barriers. The other big challenge here that we have, when these tides are high, the two roads that are in and out of the neighborhood, the only real access points, are also lower than the tides. So there's a risk not only of direct flooding, but also of really complicated and perhaps very difficult evacuation in and out of this neighborhood were there to be a flood. So we can see what it looks like when water is able to overtop one of those informal shorelines. So this is a restaurant that was doing construction and they dug a trench and that allowed the salt water from the harbor to come into the street and flow into the neighborhood. But as we go over the next 10 and 15 or 20 years, there will be more of these spots where the water is able to get over the low-lying shoreline. And so right now we have around 16,000 people that are in this area that's lower than the tides, as well as 580, 101, wastewater treatment plants, many other infrastructure assets in addition to our residents who are all sort of protected from that flood and that tidal influence right now by these informal barriers, but those will be overtopped in the coming years. This is another picture of one of those barriers, again, just to give a sense of the timing. So this is not during our highest tide, but during a king tide. And again, you can see we have just a few inches really of freeboard at the moment. So it will take a modest amount of sea level rise and subsidence for those to be overtopped. But with that, I'm going to pass the floor to my colleague Carly, who can talk more about the work that we're doing to try and address it, as well as the environmental justice implications of the project as well.
Great. Thank you, Kate. Good morning, everyone. So as Kate kind of walked us through, there's a lot of physical vulnerability to flooding in the neighborhood. And that really converges and due to histories of environmental racism, is overlaid with a lot of social vulnerability of the neighborhood as well, making this a real environmental justice issue. And so a big part of our work, and Canal Alliance is a community-based organization that's located, it was actually our office where Kate showed that photo where there could be up to 4 feet of flooding. And so we are really grateful for the opportunity to partner with the city to make sure that residents that live in the canal understand these risks and are really a part of the decision-making process for how our community can adapt and move forward, and making sure that we do that in a way that like equitably prioritizes the needs of residents in the canal. And so a key portion of our strategy and approach, it has been to stand up a steering committee of residents that live in the neighborhood to help us engage and educate other residents, and to really work with the core project team and the technical experts to understand what the options are, and to understand them from that environmental justice perspective of residents who live in the area and will be directly impacted by inaction or any of the options that we may move forward with as a community. So Kate, if you're able to go to the next slide, I'd like to kick it off by allowing Rita Mazariegos, who's one of the steering committee members, to introduce herself and talk a little bit about the project. She pre-recorded her comments so that we were able to have subtitles for them. So Kate, if we can play the video, please.
Hey folks, we actually can't hear this.
Okay, let me just try and go back to the beginning and can you hear now?
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Rita Mazariegos y
Yeah. Yes.
soy de la subida del nivel del mar de San Rafael, California. Vivo aquí por 18 años y tengo 3 preguntas que voy a preguntarme y a contestarles para que sepan un poquito más acerca de la comunidad de Canal, que es el área en donde vivimos y es en el área donde estamos trabajando con esta junta directiva. La primera pregunta es, ¿cuál es el nivel de afectación de la comunidad por el aumento del nivel del mar? Y el nivel de afectación para la comunidad en Canal es muy alta porque hay personas de diferentes países de Latinoamérica viviendo aquí por mucho tiempo y son muy pocos los que realmente están involucrados o saben que la subida del nivel del mar es algo serio y es algo que puede suceder a un largo plazo. Muchos viven ahí tienen su vida hecha, ahí tienen sus casas, sus recuerdos, sus memorias, así como muchos tienen ahí sus automóviles, que es lo que utilizan para transportarse todos los días, que es parte de sus propiedades. Y también ahí tenemos escuelas donde nuestros niños van a recibir su educación. Tenemos una librería y tenemos un centro comunitario y tenemos muchas áreas que las personas visitan para recrearse con sus hijos como parques. También tenemos varias tiendas latinoamericanas, que es en donde la mayoría de personas surte su alimentación de sus países. Entonces realmente es un área que a la hora que sufriría una inundación quedaría muy vulnerada porque es un pequeño espacio donde tenemos casi todo para sentirnos casi como en casa. Nuestra segunda pregunta es, ¿piensa usted que la gente ya sabe del riesgo de una posible inundación o de una posible subida del nivel del mar? Yo pienso que las personas de nuestra comunidad no saben el riesgo real que hay. Quizás se imaginen que eso podría suceder en algún momento por alguna lluvia fuerte, pero no se imaginan que es algo que a futuro se puede dar debido al derretimiento de polos, debido a las aguas subterráneas, debido a las fuertes lluvias y especialmente debido al cambio climático, que es el que ahora mismo nos está afectando a nivel global. Entonces, pienso que muchas personas están tan enfocadas en sobrevivir, en darle lo mejor a sus familias y no han sabido más acerca del nivel del mar, la subida del nivel del mar y sus posibles riesgos a largo plazo. La tercera pregunta es, ¿Cuál es la prioridad de nosotros como junta directiva para nuestra comunidad? Y básicamente para mí son dos. Número uno, informar a toda la comunidad de los riesgos reales que tenemos a la hora que una catástrofe nos afecte. Y la segunda es tratar de involucrar a la mayor parte de personas, tanto residentes de nuestro canal como residentes de la ciudad de San Rafael, para que nos ayuden a pasar la voz y decirle a nuestra comunidad que esto es un riesgo grande, que está próximo a venir y que debemos estar preparados con recursos y con información para poder combatir de una buena manera estos riesgos que tenemos para un futuro próximo.
Great. Thank you. Muchas gracias to Rita for sharing and bringing her comments and perspective into this space. So just to build on everything that Rita shared, to provide a little bit of context about the neighborhood, you can see in the map here that all of the areas in blue have some level of flood risk. And the area that is highlighted in red is the canal, is sort of the central canal neighborhood. And there are, around 15,000 people that live in that broader area. It's very, very densely populated. It is a very segregated neighborhood as well. In that area, over 90% of the folks that live there are Latine. Over 90% are renters. It is much lower income, much more working class than the rest of the city and the surrounding areas. And it is, as I mentioned, really densely populated. So most of the multifamily apartment buildings in San Rafael are located in the canal. And because of the housing crisis and the lack of affordability in a very high cost of living area like Marin County, many families double and triple up in apartments in order to be able to make rent. And so this area of the canal is as densely populated as parts of downtown San Francisco, and the risk of flooding is very, very concentrated on this population that is already very socially vulnerable. And we know that most of the kinds of supports that flow in the aftermath of flooding flow to property owners. There's not a lot of resources that are available for renters, and there's a lot of language access barriers and receiving information and support. And so one thing that we really want to make sure that we're naming here is that it is not a coincidence that a community that is very socially vulnerable, like the canal, is also has not had adequate investments to be able to mitigate those risks of sea level rise, given the subsidence that's already happened in the neighborhood and the risk of flooding that exists today. And we know that the renter residents are some of the least able to afford the massive investments that would be needed to adequately protect the community. But there's a big mismatch in incentives between, other areas where there may be more property owners that live in and occupy their waterfront units in other parts of the, coast of Marin. And if you could go to the next slide, Kate, actually. A lot of these apartment buildings that are on, you may have seen in the map, there's a canal, the San Rafael Creek that goes along through the neighborhood. And many of the multifamily apartment buildings, like this one at 400 Canal Street, are built right over the water. And if we can go to the next slide as well. So a big piece of our work as a community-based organization is to make sure that the tough decisions that will need to be made around finding an adaptation path for our community are made with, by, and for the current residents of the canal. And so we've pulled together a steering committee of residents. We have a technical advisory committee as well of people who have professional expertise that we can draw on. We've done focus groups with different subsectors of the community brought folks out to the waterfront to talk about these issues. Kate, next slide, please. Thank you. Here's just some more photos of the engagement that we've been doing with youth and with students and out in the community to raise awareness. Next slide, please.
Hi, Carly. So sorry, just have to jump in and let you know time is almost up.
Okay, wonderful. Just some more photos of the outreach that we've been doing. Kate, if we could click through these quickly, sort of like citizen science engagement activities. And again, just underscoring that this is a collaborative and a partnership between the city, the county, researchers at UC Berkeley, and then 2 community-based organizations like Canal Alliance and the Multicultural Center of Marin, who are trusted messengers in the community and have a lot of relationships and access to residents to be able to engage them. And I will leave it there. There's the contact information for Kate and I. And again, thanks to Rita for being able to make her comments pre-recorded.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. What a really astounding example of community-based work. Just so interesting to see all of that, especially compared to Adam's presentation from the WIA. So thank you so much, Kate, Carly, and Rita. That was fantastic. We are going to move along to our next presentation, which is with Julie Johnson. So Julie has worked for the State Resources Control Water Board in the Division of Water Quality as an engineering geologist for over 6 years. She originally joined the Ocean Standards Unit before accepting a position in the Underground Storage Tank Cleanup and GeoTracker Unit. Before working for the state, she worked in environmental consulting, focusing on contaminated site remediation. She has a master's in geology and is a licensed professional geologist. So Julie, welcome. Please take it away, and thank you.
Sorry, getting everything figured out. Let's see, can you see my screen?
Yes, and we can hear you great.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the introduction, Ella. It's truly a pleasure to be here today. Thank you as well to all of the previous panelists for all of your really amazing discussions so far. I'm very happy to be a part of the webinar today. So let's see. So today, I'm going to introduce you to the cleanup programs at the water boards and give you a brief look into how sea level rise and groundwater rise impacts contaminated sites. I'll also be talking about a new public dashboard and mapping tool that we are developing in the State Water Board's online database, GeoTracker, that will assist regulators and the public in identifying cleanup sites that are at the highest risk of impacts from sea level and groundwater rise, and how this tool will help us refocus how we evaluate and manage sites to address these impacts from climate change. So California implements multiple cleanup programs to restore and protect groundwater quality and beneficial uses. These programs provide cleanup oversight and are carried out by the State Water Board, the 9 regional water quality control boards, the Department of Toxic Substances Control, or DTSC, and approved local agencies statewide. At the State Water Board, we have 2 main cleanup programs, the Petroleum Underground Storage Tank, or UST cleanup program, and the Site Cleanup Program, or SCP, which encompasses all other types of cleanup cases. So the Division of Water Quality manages the programs statewide, and each of our 9 regional water boards house their own programs, managing cleanup cases on the ground and working directly with responsible parties, communities, and local agencies to get sites cleaned up and closed. We also have a Department of Defense program that manages cleanup of federal sites. The federal government is preparing to do their own sea level rise assessment of their sites over the next 5 years. So what is a cleanup site? Cleanup sites are places where contaminants have been spilled or released into the environment without authorization. Responsible parties, who are owners and operators, property owners, etc., are required by law to clean up the contamination. A large volume of the cleanup sites that exist are considered legacy, the spills or releases having happened decades ago. These include some of the highest risk sites that are very harmful to human health, including sites with chlorinated solvents, dioxins, polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS or PFOA, and heavy metals, to name just a few. Between the regional boards and local agencies, the programs have been highly successful and have closed around 52,000 cleanup cases over the past decades. Today, there are approximately 1,500 open UST cleanup cases and 5,400 open site cleanup cases. These remaining cases are some of the more challenging ones. There's a lot of commingled plumes and multiple classes of those contaminants that I mentioned earlier. Additionally, based on research conducted by our site cleanup program, there are around 17,000 suspected or unknown sites across the state. A lot of these are historic, like dry cleaners, other industrial sites, etc. GeoTracker is the State Water Board's online database that's used to track and archive compliance data from permitted and unauthorized discharges of waste to land and waters. The database was initially developed in 2000 with focus on leaking petroleum UST sites. Today, GeoTracker has expanded a lot and provides public access to statewide environmental data and the ability to track regulatory data for over 10 different programs in the water boards, in addition to our cleanup programs. The system also consists of an interactive GIS map, analytical tools, and other features that are utilized by state and regional board staff, local agencies, and the regulated community and the public. So there are two main climate change impacts that are affecting coastal and low-lying cleanup sites: sea level and groundwater rise. Sea level rise can cause overland flooding and infiltration, potentially leading to erosion of surface soils and mobilization of shallow contaminants. Sea level rise also translates to groundwater rise, and with saltwater intrusion pushing the existing water table closer towards the ground surface. This leads to potentially new or more hazardous vapor intrusion risks where they didn't exist before, mobilization of remaining contaminants that were previously above the water table, and potential surfacing of contamination where it could directly come into contact with people. Additionally, as we heard earlier from Kaitlyn's presentation, rising groundwater and more saline groundwaters could detrimentally impact water supply and existing subsurface infrastructure, such as underground storage tanks, sewer lines, basements. There's an obvious need to assess cleanup sites for their vulnerability to sea level and groundwater rise. There are some great regional and local efforts that are underway. However, a need for a statewide, consistent, and widely available tool has been identified. So here I'm showing a view of the Long Beach area on the GeoTracker map. There are thousands of hazardous cleanup sites located along the coastal and low-lying areas that will be impacted by sea level rise and subsequent groundwater rise. The red boxes are UST cleanup sites, green boxes are the site cleanup sites, and blue triangles are DTSC cleanup sites. And anything that you see with a black X is a closed case. So GeoTracker and EnviroStore, EnviroStore's DTSC's online database and GIS map, have a significant amount of existing groundwater elevation and contaminant concentration data. We plan to look at both open and closed sites and multiple social vulnerability data sets. Additionally, there will be a large effort to digitize historical cleanup site documents and create new site records in GeoTracker for these historical sites that are not yet in the system. The Ocean Protection Council reached out to the State Water Board and DTSC to collaboratively develop a tool that will utilize data from both GeoTracker and EnviroStore to assess the vulnerability of cleanup sites to sea level rise and groundwater rise, and develop a prioritization metric to identify the most vulnerable and hazardous cleanup sites within disproportionately served communities. The final product will be a public dashboard and map with vulnerability assessment and prioritization tools, assessing impacts from climate change on the cleanup sites. Our team is collaborating with University of California researchers who are conducting a similar project with focus on the Bay Area. Together, we discuss assessment and prioritization methods and variables, with the agencies providing a regulatory perspective on sea level and groundwater rise. So our agency team is in the process of developing the statewide tool and evaluating how to create a metric to assist with prioritizing resources. We are aiming to roll out the tool in the summer of 2026. One of the biggest challenges that the hazardous cleanup community is facing is understanding how climate change is impacting remedial technologies and evaluating how management of cleanup will change with these more severe conditions. DTSC has already done a large amount of work considering case management and sea level rise. DTSC's draft sea level rise guidance and web app are publicly available on their website. It's in review and should be finalized very soon. While the initial focus of this statewide tool that we're building will be on sea level rise and groundwater rise impacts to cleanup sites, our plan is to expand the scope to include other climate change impacts such as large precipitation events, wildfires, and others. So this tool is intended to assist agencies and localities to pinpoint sites that are at highest risk of sea level rise and groundwater rise. However, funding, especially for site cleanup sites, is limited and can only fund cleanup at a handful of sites across California each year. This tool will help us focus our limited resources to address hazardous sites in our most vulnerable communities to protect human health, safety, and the environment. And with that, thank you for your time and attention, and please feel free to reach out to our team with any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was very timely. I appreciate it. Well, that was a fantastic presentation to wrap us up. That was our last presenter and presentation, and we now have a whopping 6 minutes for questions. So we'd love to welcome some questions. We can take them in the Q&A, and folks can also raise their hand and we can unmute you. So I will pause for a minute to see if there are any questions. In the meantime, we do have one that we would love to kick us off. And so this one is from our team, actually. What are some ways that state and local governments can leverage tribal knowledge in carrying out conservation and/or restoration efforts? So this one may be for Adam. And let me know, Adam, if you didn't catch that, I can repeat it.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Well, if you find out, let me know. No. I think just, coming to tribes early, very early on when projects are kind of still in the planning phase. And, a lot of folks, I think, are eager to, to put TEK into their reports and plans, but don't really honor the amount of time that it takes to, develop a true relationship with tribes. And, I think it's really about building that relationship and providing stipends and compensation, for tribal representative time, when working on projects like this.
Great, thank you. That is absolutely, I think, one of the best practices that, a lot of us know about, and putting it into practice is crucial. So thanks for sharing that, Adam. Let me see. We're going to go to another question we have here. This one is for Andrew. Can you address the interplay among warming temperatures, OA, and hypoxia?
Sure. There's, how much time do I have? 20, 30 minutes? No. Good question. There's a lot of interplay. So on one end of the spectrum, you have just the physical chemistry of how temperature works. So as the temperature changes, it adjusts essentially the sort of seawater equation as to how much carbonate can be dissolved in the water. So just changing the temperature alone, if you change nothing else, you don't add carbon or change carbon, but just change the temperature of the water, you can change the pH of the water. So that's one part of it. The other part that's probably more important than that just has to do with the dynamics of the systems. Typically, when we have more upwelling, we have more productivity, and that tends to, as the things that are produced up in the surface, they sink down and die. And then when they die, that's what's using up the oxygen, but also changing the carbonate chemistry and causing lower pH. So generally, when we see a lot of upwelling followed by a change in the upwelling, we tend to see stuff bloom up, all the algae, then they fall to the bottom and die. And that actually has really big impacts on those sort of short terms on water pH. So those are the two I'm most familiar with, but there's a lot of other things that can affect pH too. So that's a short answer.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. And that was not 23 minutes. Thanks. Okay, our next question is, how can governmental programs leverage community knowledge? And this one, I imagine, goes to the San Rafael team, but maybe there are more who want to chime in.
I don't know, Carly, if you want to go first, but I think I think to build on Adam's point, the best strategies to create awareness of sea level rise in the community is something that takes quite a long time. And also to build the foundation for really meaningful participation in these tough planning decisions, also something that takes quite a while. So Carly, if you want to add on.
Yeah, I think that I would just echo that being thoughtful about acknowledging and equitably compensating the time that it takes for community members to participate. I also think one thing that's been really helpful in this partnership with the city is we were able to secure a grant that really builds the capacity of our community-based organization and the other partner community-based organization to be able to bring on staff like myself who can help like continuously be that bridge and help facilitate the participation and set up some of that infrastructure and those networks so that we don't need to kind of like recreate all of that for each project, that we're able to continuously engage different and educate and build the capacity of community members, which also takes time and investment and building relationships. And so I think that intentionally investing directly in residents and in trusted organizations that can help be that bridge over time has been really successful.
I'll add on to that piece. I'd be remiss not to also, just on the topic of sea level rise, not to mention OPC as a current Senate Bill 1 Sea Level Rise Adaptation Planning Grant Program. I just want to highlight that as an opportunity for state investment in sea level rise planning and adaptation planning and physical projects as well. But a huge component of those funds are to support community engagement, ensuring that projects are informed and built in partnership. Obviously not only by local governments, but within communities as well as opportunities to partner or support projects led by different California Native American tribes throughout the state. So that is a component of the grant program. But of course, every community is different. So I just appreciate, Carmen, the question, and Carly and Kate, your insight and your perspective from San Rafael.
Thank you all so much. That was really a fantastic, quick little rapid fire Q&A. Unfortunately, we are out of time now, but I know that questions can be dispersed through other channels. So I will pass it back over to Carmen. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
And that's a big thank you back at you, Ella, for the many meetings we had, brainstorming, identifying potential topics and speakers, and really appreciate the partnership in bringing together this excellent panel of speakers and the different perspectives that they brought on what we know and how we're addressing the changing ocean conditions and their impacts. So with that, with a minute left, I would like to put in a plug for our 6th and final webinar of the series. This one is a webinar that OWIHA is planning or has been planning in collaboration with 2 agency partners, the Department of Public Health and the California Air Resources Board. And the webinar will focus on the impacts on human health of changes influenced by climate change on heat, wildfire smoke, which certain parts of California are experiencing at the moment, and air quality. And so we hope to have most of you join us for that final webinar. And again, thank you to our panelists and to the Ocean Protection Council for making this webinar possible. Bye.